Newsfirst Newsline with Faraz Shaukutali.
Hello there and a very good morning. This is Newsline. I'm Sonali Wanika-Babage. Our guest this morning is Bhavani Fonseca. She's an attorney at law and also the senior researcher at the Center for Policy Alternatives. Good morning, Bhavani.
Good morning.
Thanks for joining us so early in the morning. Bhavani, last week saw the Office on Missing Persons Act being gazetted by the President. As a precursor to the conversation, let's first talk about the implications of this in simple terms.
So first, maybe explaining what the Office for Missing Persons is. It was enacted by Parliament last year in August 2016. It's the first independent permanent mechanism introduced by this government to address missing persons and the issue of enforced disappearances. And what happened last week was, after nearly 11 months of the law being enacted, the President took the first step in operationalizing this office. So there's many other steps to do, but this is the first step in ensuring that this actually starts functioning.
Right. So as of now, the Office on Missing Persons Act, further to the Act, there is no actual office in place as yet.
As far as we know, there is no office because it's just starting its first step. So the next step is, according to the law, the minister in question has to issue a gazette. We hope that happens soon. And then you have to start calling for the nominees for the office, 7 members to the Office for Missing Persons. So I don't think there is a physical office, at least publicly no one is aware of it, and it actually can't start functioning till it follows through the next step of a second gazette by the minister. And only then can it start actually getting names for the members and setting up that office.
Right. Now, you said, interestingly, that this is independent and a permanent office. Can you distinguish between this Office on Missing Persons as opposed to, for example, the other mechanisms that were introduced to look into missing persons, for example, the Paranagama Commission, etc.?
So we've had several commissions of inquiry appointed by successive governments. So since the 1990s, several presidential commissions of inquiry have been appointed, looking at enforced disappearances. The most recent was in 2013 by the President issuing the Paranagama Commission. And that looked at missing persons. It got over 25,000 complaints. So we've had several commissions with specific mandates for specific time periods. The difference with the OMP, the Office on Missing Persons, is it's going to be a permanent office which doesn't need to be renewed. It's going to be an independent office as per the Act, because it's going to be members appointed by the recommended by the Constitutional Council and appointed by the President. So very specific, different to the previous entities, and there is no worry about how long this office runs, because it can look at cases as long as that investigation is required. So it could run for 5 years, 10 years, it just depends on the caseload and how fast the investigations can take place.
Bhavani, you're someone who has been following this issue in particular. Now, when we take the national unity and reconciliation process of the country, and we take a look at measures such as the establishment of the OMP, do you think we're on the right track, or how much further away from the right track are we?
So going back to 2015, the commitments made by this government of political solution or reconciliation, this is one step, but I would say it's a very small step in terms of gazetting the OMP. As I said, law was enacted last year, nearly 11 months. I think in a few weeks we get into the 1 year anniversary of the enactment of the law. So this is a very, very small step. There's so many other things that need to be done to ensure there is sustained reconciliation and there is a political solution to the ethnic question in Sri Lanka. But at least we seem to be heading in the right direction. I say seem to be because there's so much more that's needed to show this demonstrable change in this country. But from where we were several years ago, at least we see some movement much more is needed.
Okay, so speaking about demonstrable steps, the Prevention of Terrorism Act is still in place. Now, this has been referred to as a draconian piece of legislation by many, and the need for counterterrorism legislation, which is in line with international standards, has been stressed by parties across the board. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, the government committed to repeal and reform the PTA, the Prevention of Terrorism Act, which is several decades old. And for civil society, human rights groups, we have been calling for this for years. So this is not a new call. Now, in recent weeks, we saw a lot of noise about reforming, new aspects, a proposed counterterrorism proposal. I don't think there is a bill as such that we can comment on, at least publicly we haven't seen it. So the important thing is the government carries through its commitment of repealing, reforming, but it's also important to engage, communicate to the people, to the victims, to civil society, to the lawyers, as to what it is and what the process is. So we are talking about the need for reform. We really haven't seen actual draft bill to comment on it. So a lot of noise, but really demonstrably we haven't seen much action on that. So I would urge the government, not just on the PTA, so many other things they committed to in 2015. Let's start that work immediately, because more than 2 years after, we're having the same or similar conversations.
Right. Now you spoke about the importance of consultation. Something that we've seen is, Bhavani, when it comes to the introduction of certain legislation, there is very little consultation. For example, the News Media Standards Act first discussion draft, which was just found on the internet, with zero consultation with mainstream media, for example, and other stakeholders, was found to be quite shocking by society in general. So similarly, I mean, we have experts in different varying fields in Sri Lanka, but there seems to be discussions only happening behind closed doors. How dangerous is this?
Very dangerous, and that's why my main point earlier was there has to be consultation, there has to be transparency and engagement. So one of the things this government did in 2015 is removing the clause on the urgent bills. So we at least now don't have to wake up on one morning and realize there's an urgent bill before Parliament, and it closes people to challenge that option. There is some progress in that. But coming back to the OMP and the media, the proposed bill that you talk about, these are things that many people don't know what it is. And there has to be a much more concerted effort by the government, but also other actors, to ensure there is a public debate as to why these laws are needed, what are the aspects of a proposed legislation that should be amended, changed in terms of the views of the people. So the government did 2 consultative processes in 2016, one on the constitution process, one on the reconciliation. So very important processes, national processes of consultation. But in that process, we also realized the OMP was introduced while those consultations were happening, and very limited conversation. So I think there has to be a much more genuine effort by the government to engage the different stakeholders, to have those conversations. Because why are we rushing through legislation that's going to impact thousands or millions of citizens without them understanding what it is?
So even if we take the OMP Act, I mean, immediately after it was introduced, there was another amendment, right, which was a little hilarious.
So, I mean, if you go back to the OMP process, it was gazetted in May last year. It was there was hardly a debate in Parliament. It was rushed through, and very limited information at that time what it is, what the implications are. So, and that was something we urged at that time, have a larger conversation. Why are you so scared of having these conversations? And that you see a problem even now, more than a year after that process started, people still don't know what this OMP is, and that is a problem. Then you have an amendment being brought in, which was introduced a few weeks ago, which amended the initial act, a specific clause of the act. Now, I wonder how many people even know about that process. So I think definitely there has to be a larger campaign of communicating, of transparency, of explaining what it is, what it's not, what the implications are.
Bhavani, now it's interesting to note that when we go into the Act itself, the OMP, it says that this Office on Missing Persons will have investigative powers. Can you just elaborate on what exactly this would entail?
Maybe the main point here is to explain that the OMP is to investigate. It's a fact-finding in search of the truth. It's nothing else. So there are misconceptions of what it is and what it's not. Again, communication, explaining what it is, and a main power of the OMP is to investigate as to what happened to a person who's missing or who has been disappeared, forcibly disappeared. And it has specific powers, and these powers you can see in some of the existing entities like the Human Rights Commission.
Sure.
So you have powers to enter, to search, to investigate, and these powers are provided very clearly in the Act, mainly to ensure, to find out what happened and to provide that information to a loved one. So that is the main investigative power, and it stops there. Any other action on a specific case has to be taken by the Attorney General's Department and existing entities. The OMP will only have that investigative powers. Connected to that, though, is providing protection to anyone who needs that protection. And we've seen the need, and so the OMP has that aspect as well, but only through the investigative powers it has.
Bhavani, let's talk a bit about how legislation is supposed to filter down to the masses, the general public, not just the intellectuals, not just the academics or the politicians. Recently, I watched a very short documentary called The Dumbing Down of America, where, for example, someone would just, point a camera and say, okay, who's this? And point to like Joe Biden. And like a university student in America wouldn't know, but his or her parent would. Do you think that as a country, we are not really focusing on the important, significant aspects in our education system? I mean, what's going wrong? Why are our people not aware of, for example, new legislation which could benefit them potentially?
Well, it goes back to a main point we discussed before about lack of information. So how would someone be able to be even aware this legislation is taking place, the process is happening, if that information is not out there? So if media and other actors don't know what it is, if it's done through secret means or a secret process, no one really knows. But there is also the other aspect of, are people really interested? Now, a bill has to go to Parliament, it has to be gazetted, it becomes a public document. So anyone interested also can take the trouble to check what's out there. So it's a balancing thing. But if I don't know something's in the pipelines, I wouldn't want to actually bother to kind of find out. So it's two ways. And I think it's very important to create that interest as to why these processes are important to citizens. So in a nutshell, why do we need reforms? Why is that going to impact our lives, the future generations? That conversation is very limited, and very limited to very specific groups. So I think it needs to be much more pushed to the different aspects, to different actors, to ask and have that conversation, have the debate. Do we need a new constitution? Do we need new laws and institutions? I think it's very critical all of us play that role and kind of have a debate, have an engagement, agree to disagree when it's needed, but have those processes.
Okay. Let's also talk a bit about the constitutional reform process. Is it at a standstill these days? I mean, what's going on, really?
Well, I think you need to ask the people who are involved in the process, because it's within a steering committee now. I'm not part of that. I think that's very important to have those conversations with the right people, but at least in the media it seems to indicate that there is some progress. The conversations are happening. Maybe not as fast as we would have liked it to happen, because as I said, 2015 we were talking about a new constitution, a new political solution. So why is it more than 2 years after we're still not sure if this is going to happen? But granted, these are very sensitive, tricky issues which requires a more concerted effort of conversation, deliberation, thinking through. And in a way, going back to 2016, when we saw the consultation process happening, thousands of people went and engaged in the with the PRC. So there is interest, but I think the question for many is really what is happening now. 2016, you had the consultations, you had subcommittee reports coming out. We were promised an interim report in December, and then it's been reported at least that it's been delayed, possibly coming out in a few weeks, possibly. So I think it's we'll have to see where it is, but there is concern whether it's moving as fast as it should be moving.
Bhavani, we also hear now that the local government elections will be further delayed. How dangerous is this for democracy in general?
Well, we haven't had elections, local government elections, for a couple of years, and I think it's a very dangerous trend when you keep postponing a very fundamental right, a right of franchise, a right where citizens should be able to go and vote and select their elected representatives. So I hope the delays are not further delay. I mean, there is some movement on this. And every week, I think we see in the media various statements made by the government, various actors saying it's going to happen, the delimitation is taking time. And I think now is the time for the leadership, for the president, for the prime minister to come and clearly say this is the time period, this is when elections are going to happen. And be very clear, when are the local government elections going to happen, when are the provincial council elections going to happen, why is there a delay? And again, explain, communicate to the people.
Right. Bhavani, as with all governments, something that we see is that the processes are, in general, for example, the local government elections, processes are manipulated. And at the end of the day, the people, the general public, are unaware of what their rights and responsibilities are. So how do we bridge this gap, Bhavani? In your opinion, how do we bridge this gap between, say, the lack of awareness among the general public and, on the other hand, the politicians who try to manipulate the system, a system which is often obscure? I mean, it's in statutes and legal documents.
And it's a point we keep making, is that it's insufficient to just have the law or a policy. The action, the implementation is critical. And in that, it's not just the government that's responsible, it's the citizenry, it's political parties, it's the media, it's civil society groups.
Sure.
Everyone has a role to play. And in that's why it's very important to even engage as to why the OMP hasn't been established. I think the vibrant debate is very important. But a vibrant debate that's informed, not a vibrant debate that spreads deliberate misinformation. So I think everyone has very specific roles to play, from implementing a law that's in place to possibly challenging laws, policies, practices. So I think everyone has to kind of stand up, wake up to it and say, look, these are things we need to ask for, these are things we need to fight for within the legal framework. I'm not saying, just go onto the streets and start protesting for everything, but within the legal means, push those boundaries. I think ask the difficult questions, because one shouldn't be complacent and assume these things are just going to happen. One also has to, as a citizen, as an individual, play a very, very active role in making sure this happens. The reform agenda that was promised in 2015, that many actually were part of. I think we need to now say, look, where is it now? What's happened? What are the problems? And keep pushing, because sitting back is not going to give us anything.
Right. Bhavani, I'd like to come back to the counterterrorism legislation that we spoke of earlier on. Can you sort of take our viewers through the importance of taking into account the fact that we are now post-conflict, moving into reconciliation, national unity, and also the importance of adhering to international best practices in terms of counterterrorism legislation? How do we sort of create a balance?
So within Sri Lanka, in a post-war setting, there's so much more to do, I think, to transition to a post-conflict.
Right.
The government has committed to very specific steps in 2015. One is repeal, reform the PTA, but several other steps in terms of ensuring rights are protected. We already have a constitution which provides for fundamental rights, guarantees of fundamental rights. A new constitution process is underway to hopefully improve on it, ensuring the international standards are brought in, due process is there, safeguards are there. So I think it's very important to realize that when we are talking about proposed legislation, what is in there? Is it in adherence to the international framework? Does it have the safeguards of ensuring protection of anyone who's arrested, detained? Are there fears of enforced disappearance? And these are not new issues in Sri Lanka. We've seen that for decades. And I think the important thing is, in terms of the proposed legislation, proposed frameworks, to ensure that those safeguards are in place. So for citizens, I think very important questions is, what is being proposed? Is it going to ensure the safeguards that we've seen violated for years, for decades, by successive governments, on one government, and ensure those safeguards are in place? So I think for citizens, it's asking those questions. For politicians to ask questions, to hold the government to account, and to again start that conversation to make sure if there are things that need to be pushed, corrected, that it's done immediately.
Okay, I'd like to draw your attention to a recent piece of legislation that was proposed, the Inland Revenue Act. In the initial stages, the Inland Revenue Department officials themselves came forward and said, look, we haven't been consulted on this. And this draft seems to be from the IMF. Right, where an entire set of laws which had sort of been there for decades and decades, the Inland Revenue Act, was supposed to be sort of put aside, and then this brand new draft brought in. It's before Parliament now, but Bhavani, can you stress on the importance of that not happening? I mean, sometimes it appears to be that the government would bring in a draft which doesn't really fit into our Sri Lankan sort of framework.
So, Sonali, I can't comment on the details of the Inland Revenue Bill because I haven't studied it. But the process is very important, and that goes to the heart of what we've been talking about.
Right.
If people do not know what it is, if experts who've been involved in it are not sure what it is or who's influencing it, are there external actors influencing the process? What are the concepts that are being brought in? It's hugely problematic because how does it impact us? How does it impact the citizen? So that process needs to be corrected. That's why the lawmaking process in Sri Lanka has been discussed, debated for decades, and there's been proposals pushed. The one thing that I think is very important, a big change, is the right to information. So people actually now can access information. The fact that urgent bills were removed, so the 19th Amendment brings in very positive safeguards, positive steps forward. But if we're still in 2017 having a situation where people involved in that issue, involved in a department, says they're not involved in the conversations, they have not been consulted, that's hugely problematic. And I think for the government, it's also something to pay attention to, because what is the end result you're trying to achieve? You're having a law, possibly, if it's enacted, that doesn't have ownership of the people who are actually expected to be implementing it. So going back to even the OMP, if people who are to be implementing it don't know or are not involved in the conversation, that's actually going to be a problem in the implementation. So it's not just having the law, but it's ensuring everyone's engaged, aware, involved, and takes ownership of it.
Right. Let's also talk a bit about the positive steps that we've seen since the new change in 2015, January 8th. We saw the 19th Amendment as well as the Right to Information Act, which now provides citizens with the ability to access public documents through an information officer established at public departments. Bhavani, do you think that we can be satisfied with the RTI as it is, or what more needs to be done in that respect?
So as I said, there's been some positive steps. I think the RTI is a step forward. It's something that many have been asking for years. This is in 2015. We all welcomed. The implementation, again, like many others, has been slow.
Right.
So it's to be seen how it's going to play out. So, I won't also call this government new. It's been more than 2 years now. So in 2.5 years, really, what is it that we are looking at? So the RTI is a framework, a positive framework. Now it's to be seen how citizens can access it, how they can get information. Is that information readily available, or are you going to get caught into more bureaucratic steps where there are more delays? So we'll have to see, because it's something quite new in terms of the implementation aspect of it. And I think in a couple of months we may be able to comment whether there needs to be more improvement. I would say it's early days, but at least the concept is there. People can access it. There is greater transparency through that process. There's greater accountability through that process. So anyone, you, me, we can ask questions as to what it is. So if there's a specific law that is being proposed, if there is a particular action that is going to happen or has happened, we can ask for that information. It's up to the government entity or the entities to deny it, but you still then have a process of appeal.
Process, yes.
So you have those safeguards, and that's a positive thing.
One of the practical issues that was brought to my attention when I recently went to a government department, Bhavani, with an RTI request, something that one of the information officers told me was that sometimes they get inundated with sort of requests which aren't really in public interest, like the request that he mentioned was how much is being spent on a tea for the entire department, so things like that. So if you juxtapose it with the converse, which is in places like India, you find even at grassroots level the RTI being used, but in Sri Lanka that is still to be seen. How do we sort of create this paradigm shift?
So I would say India, it's progressed quite a bit. There is a large activism around it. In Sri Lanka, as I said, the activism was there, but the legislation is only 2 years old. So I think there has to be more time to see how it plays out. Now, we also keep hearing this about inundation, about information officers not knowing what to do. So I think it's also, again, going back to preparation. How prepared was this government to roll out the RTI framework? And I think that's disappointing. There's much more could have been done. Now, that said, is sufficient work being done now for the future. And I think there are, in certain departments, we see an improvement. So again, it's also citizens knowing what they can access, what they are able to access, because there are certain restrictions as well, and what is the appeal process. All of that is there. How it's going to be used is going to be critical. Now, I think it's also important for us, for civil society, for media, for other actors, to also say, look, you have now the RTI framework. Use it. But use it responsibly, not keep inundating just because you want to ask a specific question that may not be the most relevant to get information.
All right, thank you very much for this very informative conversation. Bhavani Fonseca, Senior Researcher at the Center for Policy Alternatives and Attorney at Law. We'll see you again tomorrow.